Welcome. Today we're interviewing Jørgen Vig Knudstorp, the executive chairman of the Lego Brands Group and a member also of the IMD Foundation Board. Jørgen, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Lego today, actually yesterday, I think Lego released remarkable results for the first half of the year, and so we'll talk about this. But I also want to take you back, because next year will be for you 20 years at Lego.
Yeah.
Many of them, of course, at the head of Lego, but you joined Lego relatively young after having started your career as a kindergarten teacher, and then starting an academic career at Aarhus Business School, and then a few years at McKinsey. And so you joined Lego in 2001.
Yeah.
Become CEO in 2004, the first non-family member, at a time where the company is already an iconic company, but is not doing well. And over the next 13 years, your tenure was remarkably successful. I think sales increased 600%, profits increased enormously, and Lego also became the largest toy company in the world. Tell us a little bit about how it felt and how it was to take over this company at that, again, relatively young age and with a lot of pressure, and then also some of the things that helped you to turn around the company.
So the company was, when I arrived, a very happy, enthusiastic company, but it was not at all performing, but it didn't really know, because there was no balance sheet really consolidated for management. There was no measure of value creation or customer satisfaction or engagement. And results had been a bit up and down, but overall the company had grown for almost 70 years organically and very rarely producing a loss. And it was family owned, so there was no listed stock price. So there was no real sense that things were terribly wrong, but at the same time, a sense that perhaps they weren't that great. And in fact, one of the first things I did was to put together a paper that was sort of like a 360 view of the enterprise and presenting an outlook for the company and an analysis of its real underlying performance. And I was a very naive young man. I presented this to the board and to the owner, and I got kicked out of the boardroom, of course. And I remember the chairman being good enough to say, let's not shoot the messenger, but can you please leave? And so I left, and I thought that was the end of a very nice time in an absolutely wonderful company. But of course, the board came back and said, can you help us take this business forward in a different way?
Wow. And so you, just for us, maybe identify one or two of the key pillars of this turnaround.
My situation from a personal leadership perspective was, as you said, I was very young, I was very inexperienced, I was very naive. And so I leaned very much on the organization and on customers and said, what should I do? And it turned out to me that sort of the generic of a turnaround really is stabilize the situation. Secondly, restore productivity. Number 3, return to growth. And so in a way, the analogy is of an accident happening in a road accident, stop the bleeding, stop the engine from driving. Then you take the patient to the hospital and stabilize it. And then you go into retraining. I think one of the huge advantages of the private ownership and for the Lego company as such was to be able to actually spend the better part of 5 years in those first 2 phases of stabilizing the situation and restoring productivity, and then about 5-6 years in releasing the engines and returning to growth, which then became a staggering period of growth of more than 10 years of plus 15% compounded annual organic growth rates.
One of the things that I think goes back to this period is an enormous amount of innovation, coming up with new products. You also, I think, have spoken about paradoxical leadership. Can you comment both on the innovation and also on this notion of paradoxical leadership?
So the first thing we did was to really establish a benchmark of innovation by looking at what we ought to be able to do. And that meant really thinking about delivering a model that made our customers successful. In that case, that would be the retailer. So how do we innovate in a way that's exciting for the retailer, but driven, what I'd call a front-wheel driven car? That means it starts with the end consumer, the family and the child. what is it they would recommend? At that time, it turned out to be the major driver of that is what you'd call schoolyard currency. That means, do you talk about our product to somebody else? Now, of course, today, that's social media. Nobody goes to the schoolyard anymore. They use their devices to do that. And the way to really measure that is something like Net Promoter Score. So we made that the king proxy of the recovery. Can we bring our products to be so exciting that they get recommended by everybody? Turns out the founder of the company said, I really don't like selling and marketing. He said that back in 1955. I would like to make a product of such high distinction that people talk about it to other people. So for me, it was going back to the roots of what the company had always been about, but instilling that in the innovation engine. And that then led us into really mapping, how do children play? What categories of play exist? How can we be relevant? How do we make it exciting? How do we make it learning through play? And we used a lot of ethnographic studies to that. So we sent designers living with households in Boston, in Germany, in China, to try and make a proposition. So for instance, we had never really experienced a breakthrough in products that are particularly relevant for the younger girls. And so we had designers living in places like Beijing, Boston, Berlin, in household, in the girls' bedroom, understanding how they think, what they're interested in, really mapping the world of how girls interact and play. And out of that came a product line called Lego Friends, which we launched in as late as 2011 and is a phenomenal success even today, 10 years later.
Now, paradoxical leadership.
So I really love that thing because I think leadership is too complex and it's more of a practice than it can be distilled into always focus, always execute. There is a balancing act. And so one of the things we spoke about is it is important we have an identity and we're proud of who we are and what we stand for as a brand. But at the same time, we need to be the humblest in taking in a challenge to that. So we need to be better at executing than strategizing. But at the end of the day, we're a global company that only survive on our capability base, so we got to be strong on strategy as well.
In 2017, sometimes people step down from the CEO position. I guess you stepped up to become executive chairman of the Lego Brands Group. And one of the challenges with these organizations is how do we make the whole more than the sum of the parts? So how do you and the board and the leadership teams ensure that the whole is more than the sum of the parts?
What we decided to do was to have a completely different structure. So we took the point of view that we operate from a family owner level, and I'm now sitting alongside at the owner and holding an investment level. So we allocate capital and we set high-level strategies and focus on the hiring and retention and development of the CEOs and board members. But we don't require the different Lego entities to act as if they're part of one corporation. Instead, we use the word, which I think is a bit abused today, ecosystem. But I like the word because to me, it gives the understanding not of a well-manicured garden, but more like a forest, where we recognize there are big trees and small trees, and there are some that are very embryonic and some in the venture area, and there are some that are very well established, like an old oak tree that gives energy and power to the rest of the ecosystem. And in that notion, every Lego entity actually goes about doing what it's all about. What is its specific business model? Serving the education market, serving hospitality and leisure in location-based entertainment, theme parks, serving digital plays, serving education, serving the toy market. Those are very different business models under the same brand, and they go about doing their own thing, not caring about the rest of the ecosystem. But in reality, like in a real biological ecosystem, they do produce synergies because one is feeding off the other. So when we are successful in the toy business, the theme park business will be doing better. So it's quite a different philosophy of building a business system.
So we're recording this interview in early September 2020, which means that it's become quite clear to all of us that the COVID-19 crisis is going to be with us for another 6 to hopefully not more than 18 months, but is definitely more than a passing period. Nevertheless, the first half of the year was very difficult for some companies. Apparently, I'm not going to say less difficult for Lego because it was difficult for Lego, sure. But you guys did remarkably well during H1. Are there one or two or three things that you said, wow, we really did this very, very well, that somehow ended up contributing to this remarkably successful period in the first half of the year?
So first I'd say across our ecosystem, we've seen ups and downs. There are businesses such as location-based entertainment that obviously have been closed. Also our education business has been struggling, schools have been closed. The very core in the toy business, the play material business has done remarkably well. And I think all of them has shared a set of principles of putting people first, staff and customers, taking care of safety first and all, and then securing business continuity. And there I think we've seen the benefit of not what has been done over the last 3 to 6 months, but what has been done over long periods of time in terms of building resilience. And building resilience is something that is a cultural artifact, the capacity to deal with unanticipated events relatively quickly, the flexibility to reset and adjust. And the LEGO Group has been extraordinary in its capacity to replan the year and engage its audience through digital means such as the Let's Build Together campaign that had more than 80 million unique users. So really fast reconfiguration of how to run the business model, and a lot of product launches being moved around to be able to still keep sales at a very impressive level. I'm very impressed with how the team has done, also from a supply and manufacturing perspective, shifting things around. I've always said to our organization, I think we're probably 80 to 90% responsible for our outcomes. The rest is external factors. So that means we have a big responsibility. We're not protected by any structural barriers. It's an open global market. It's very innovation driven. So we can't really blame anybody but ourselves, and we should celebrate that when things are going well. Or we should also remember when things are not going so well, there's only one person who can be blamed for that, and that is ourselves inside the company. And a final very important element has been, as we went through our near-death situation now almost more than 15 years ago, we decided we want to build a financial reserve. So this year we've, of course, from the owner family side, benefited from having all the excess liquidity that was needed to have a calm mind in the midst of a storm. And that's a principle we will always stay with, that we have the reserves to go through, because things will go up and down through generations. If
you reflect on the last 20 years, the world is a different place, obviously. What has changed, and in particular, what has changed from a top management, senior leadership point of view? How is the world of a senior leader different today than it was when you became the CEO of LEGO? When I was a young man, we spoke about climate change, but now we've lost the opportunity almost to address it. Back then we spoke about the Rio Accord, now we're up to Paris Accord, and it's become a much more pressing issue. And that is a shift in the way we think business today from 20 years ago. The other element I would call out is globalization. Again, when I was a young man, we spoke about Japan and China as economic superpowers. Today, it's not worthwhile discussing whether China will be the world's economic superpower. It's a fact. And if we ignore it, just like if we ignore climate change, what are we doing? So that is something that cannot be ignored. And the third one, I would say, is the type of technology we use in business. So we've been through the era of transistors and microprocessors. We knew it was the IBM era, and then we went through the Microsoft Intel era with the PC client, and then we went into the web with the Googles of the world. We are now in an age of AI and a third generation of internet. And we know it's there, and it's going to be there the next 10 years, and we need to relate to that. And that drives very different business models and disruptive change. So I think in a simple way, technology, climate change / demographics, and of course, the emergence of Asia, and in particular China, as a world power, is quite simply something every leader today simply cannot ignore. And you mentioned climate change. Of course, a lot of what LEGO does is made of plastics. And tell us a little bit how the toy part of the group, but more generally the group, thinks about the challenges and opportunities associated with sustainability. So we think it's a fact that we need to adjust. We think it's a long-term journey, but one of the things the family's holding company has done is invest near enough €1 billion into offshore wind generation to really ensure
a supply of renewable energy from sustainable sources. So the problem of the environmental sort can, for us, be sorted into three buckets. One is sustainable production and supply chain. The second one is sustainable products that are designed for end of life and produced from sustainable materials. And the third element is really circular business models where the product never becomes waste and is in an eternal recycling. And we're pretty far on establishing a sustainable supply chain with very little waste and renewable sources of energy, in particular what's in our own scope. And because we are 80-90% manufacturing in-house, we can really work on that. We have a bigger job to be done on the full scope 3 of the global supply chain. And that brings us into the product side, where we are currently phasing in bio-based PE, so sustainable types of plastics, but are far from our ambition in 10 years from now. Our stated ambition is to be much more based on sustainable sources of supply, and that will really address that second problem. Then there's the third problem of a more circular business model. And on that one, it's still a very open quest, and I think will be a longer journey to really get to that place where that can be possible. But our view is that this is something that needs to be solved in our generation. The world needs sustainable climate solutions.
Can you comment for us a little bit on the positives and the challenges of working and of leading a family-based group?
What I love about that is that it's like when you are in a founder-run business, there's a pride and ownership in product. It's not about sales. It's not about profit margins. It's not about shareholder value creation in the narrow sense. Now, at the same time, a family business understands that they can't have a lot of debt because there's limited credit resources because they're not willing to go to the capital market for that credit. So they do understand we need to be profitable. But profit is like, or cash flow is a better word, because that's really what a family cares about, is cash flows. And cash flow is oxygen to the body. So without that, we're gone. And the family completely understands that. But at the same time, we're here to do more things than just breathe the air. It's this desire to make a dent in the world by delivering extraordinary product. And that's what I have personally experienced in the family business I've been involved in, is there's huge ownership of making a difference and the values of the product. And so if you're not aligned with those values, you're really struggling in the family business. And if you think everything is about the next quarter, the next 6 months, and what profit you're producing and how that looks in the media, you're off guard. It's not what a family business is about.
Companies need to keep reinventing themselves, and particularly in the world we live in. And of course, Lego, the Lego Group, and the Christensen family has sponsored a chair at IMD, and that chair is currently held by Professor Howard Yu. And Howard wrote a book last year referring to thriving in a world where everything can be copied. And of course, the Lego brick has been copied, and a lot of your ideas over the years have been copied. How does the group keep reinventing itself?
So I think and Howard's work is so meaningful and so important for so many companies. And I think the Lego brick is a great icon of that, because anybody could 3D scan the brick and produce it tomorrow. But it's about a lot more than the brick. And I would say sort of 3 things about that. One is having a deep purpose. So the Lego brick is not just about toying around with Lego bricks. It is about creatively expressing your ideas, using your imagination, and thereby learning through play. So there's a much deeper meaning and functional benefit from the product than just the physical. And that's harder to copy, and that requires careful design thinking to deliver that experience to the end consumer. And then I say there are 2 other things which I'd refer to as operating model and marketing value chain, if you like. So what's really hard to copy is that we make almost 100 billion Lego elements a year, run them in a complex global supply chain. We know through technology where every single element is and how does inventories, designs, color variations, shape variations get produced in the right order, the right quantity at the optimal cost, and are ready at 5 p.m. at Walmart's DC in Arkansas. That's a very complex problem to solve and really hard to copy. Similarly, on the marketing side, it's not just making bricks, It's making themes that children are into. It's making short-form content, small TV series. It's being one of the most watched brands on YouTube. It's producing Lego movies. It's going into theme parks. It's into TV shows like Lego Masters. So you have quite a complex marketing value chain that you orchestrate and execute on a global scale, supported by fantastic marketing assets and a really reactive global supply chain that can scale up and down depending on where the demand is going.
Last question. Today we are announcing that the Lego Group and the Christiansen family have decided to make another gift to the Lego chair. And that gift to the Lego chair will help sponsor the work of a new center that we're creating called the Center for Future Readiness. So what, if anything, are you hoping that the chair and the center will achieve?
So I think the center is extremely exciting because it really tries to understand how to drive new growth in addition to the work on avoiding getting copied. So it's so relevant for us because it's about building capabilities that make you successful in the future. And how do you know? What are those capabilities? What is your codified knowledge? And how can you really accelerate that to build the future success? And for us, that applies to our whole Lego branded ecosystem. So we know this is going to be of tremendous interest and value to us, but it's also something that I think will be of huge interest to many different industries across automobiles or pharmaceuticals and technology. So we look so much forward to that. And then, of course, we've had a multi-decade-long collaboration with IMD, and we recognize it as a school that believes in you really only understand things when you construct them yourselves. You know, it's not about learning theory. I've actually sometimes met people at IMD who said, I don't believe in training, I believe in real practice. And we are very much advocating the same thing, that we only truly understand things when we create our own knowledge. And I think IMD is a school that's pushing people to understand things through themselves and thereby making it a real learning.
It's quite inspiring and frankly quite remarkable to have been able to watch you over the years and indeed what you have accomplished, of course, with your leadership teams, but also the personal journey that you've gone through. So thank you very much, Jørgen, and we look forward to continuing to interact with you and with the group for many years. Thank you.
Thank you.